Well, that was a very authentic way to start a lecture on the Puritans, because, of course, they sang the Psalms, they sang them unaccompanied. And I chose that particular psalm because it was that version of it was written by a man called William Keith, who was a friend of Anthony Gilby, and we'll come to that later in the lecture. So thank you, Aubrey, and friends at Countersthorpe for inviting me to come and speak to you tonight. And alongside, of course, the wonderful portraits that Danielle has made. And that's what started me off when I saw them at the exhibition. And I said, where are the Leicestershire Puritans? And that's how we're here tonight. Well, I'm going to start with a question. Who were the Puritans? And if I were to ask you to define a Puritan, I wonder what you would say. And I suspect there would be a range of different answers. And historians have expended a lot of words trying to grapple with a definition and a time span for Puritanism. And there are many stereotypes and caricatures of Puritans as stern killjoys, as we know. The term itself was originally one of abuse, coined by its opponents and rejected by the people who were given the label. It wasn't one homogeneous movement, but it covered a diverse spectrum of moderate and radical opinions, and it shifted over the 150 years or so in which the label Puritan was applied. And although there's no agreed cut-off point when Puritanism ended, some would argue this was after the Restoration in the 1660s, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the term dissent began to be used. Some people even call Spurgeon the last of the Puritans, so it's quite loose. But tonight I'm going to be focusing on the period before the outbreak of civil war in 1642, so the earlier part of the Puritan movement. Despite the difficulty of precise definition, however, there are certain characteristics which the people themselves, who were labelled as Puritans, would have recognised in each other. The Puritans were heirs of the 16th century Protestant Reformation, begun on the continent under Martin Luther. They firmly upheld the 5 Reformation solas, that is, that Christians are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, revealed by Scripture alone, to the glory of God alone. And Puritans were almost all Calvinists of different shades, and they were zealous for the gospel of Jesus Christ and holy living. Someone described Puritans as the hotter sort of Protestants, and they were characterised by their form of Bible-based experiential piety known as practical divinity, marked by such things as a strict observance of the Lord's Day, self-examination, prayer and fasting. The majority of them also would have adhered to what later became known as the regulative principle, only doing in worship what the Bible specifically commands. And many of them favoured a Presbyterian system of church government. But essentially, in its outer manifestation, Puritanism initially was a movement within the Church of England for further reformation. So let's look briefly at the context of how Puritanism developed in England historically before we come to consider its impact in Leicestershire and its relevance for us today. Well, the English Reformation under the Tudors in the 16th century had a bumpy ride. In 1534, Henry VIII had broken his links with the Pope in Rome as a means of obtaining a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And the Church of England was set up under the King's authority. However, Henry remained attached to many Roman Catholic doctrines and practices, and those who wanted to introduce religious reform had to move slowly as the king blew hot and cold. But one positive thing that Henry did do was to appoint godly Protestant tutors for his son Edward, who espoused the truths of the gospel at a young age. Only 9 when he succeeded his father on the throne in 1547, Edward VI, who was called our young Josiah, was eager to press forward with reform of the church, aided by his Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. But the task was a massive one, and they simply ran out of time. Only 6 years later, young Edward was dead. Attempts to put his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne were soon foiled when Mary Tudor, Edward's much older Catholic half-sister, was proclaimed Queen. And Mary's mission was to return England to the papal fold, and nearly 300 Protestants were burnt to death in the 1550s. And when Elizabeth I became Queen in 1558, after Mary's death, there was much uncertainty. How long would her reign be? The last two had been very short. What kind of church would be established? The population as a whole was sick of religious change, and many felt confused. The Elizabethan religious settlement was certainly Protestant, but of a more moderate kind than that of Edward VI's time. The Church of England still retained many things from its Catholic past, its liturgy, ceremonies and vestments, as well as its church buildings and its rule by bishops. Elizabeth made it clear that she did not want any further reformation. But within the Church of England, there were those who regarded it as only halfly reformed. The job had only been half done. These people began to press for a more thorough reformation of the English Church along biblical lines, and to bring it in accordance with sister reformed churches on the continent, especially that of Geneva. And from 1564, their opponents labelled them derisively as Puritans. So what then was the context in which Puritanism began in Leicestershire? This is just a bit of Leicestershire background. In the 14th century, Leicestershire had been at the forefront of early reforming movements when John Wycliffe was based in Lutterworth. From there, the Bible was issued in English, and for the first time, people could read the scriptures in their own language. And followers of Wycliffe's teachings, known as Lollards, spread the message throughout the county and further afield. However, Lollardy was heavily persecuted, especially in its Leicestershire heartland, and as a result had been largely stamped out in the county by about 1400. In other parts of England, such as Coventry and the Chiltern Hills, communities of Lollards lingered on up till the outbreak of the 16th century Protestant Reformation in 1517. By 1558, when Elizabeth came to the throne, much work was needed to establish gospel truth and dispel ignorance and superstition in Leicestershire. One of the great reformers, Hugh Latimer, had grown up in Thurkeston, but he'd left for London. And Mary's reign had witnessed only a couple of other Leicestershire martyrs. But there were a number of powerful, recusant Roman Catholic gentry families in Leicestershire, such as the Beaumonts of Colorton and, just over the border into Derbyshire, the Shirleys of Staunton Harold. They harboured priests in their homes, and they continued to practice the old religion. In this dark situation, in his providence, God raised up a man with, quotes, a zealous care to promote the gospel of Christ in our county. And that man was Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, who was the most powerful figure in Leicestershire after 1560, who became known as the Puritan Earl. Just a word here. He was the 3rd Earl of Huntingdon. He wasn't married to Selina, famous Countess of Huntingdon. She was married to the 9th Earl, so she came after him. So we'll consider the life and contribution of Henry Hastings first, then look in a bit more detail at two men he introduced to the county, Anthony Gilby and Arthur Hildersham. So Henry Hastings, his early life up to the age of 23. Henry Hastings was born in 1536 into one of the highest noble families in the land. His father, Francis Hastings, the 2nd Earl, was a leading member of the aristocracy, and through his mother, Catherine Pole, Henry was descended from Plantagenet royalty. He was related to Richard III. They could have dug his body up if they wanted to do the DNA tests. And so close was he to the throne, in fact, that when the unmarried Queen Elizabeth fell seriously ill early in her reign, in 1562, many committed Protestants wanted Henry Hastings to be named as her heir. But Elizabeth recovered and the moment passed. But she remained suspicious of Henry Hastings for a long time, though his loyalty to her was absolute. And Henry Hastings was only a year or so older than Henry VIII's son and heir, Prince Edward. And he was among a small group of noble boys who were invited to share lessons with Edward. The education was rigorous, as might be expected for those who were going to fill the highest offices in the land. But as we've heard, the tutors were learned Protestants who loved the word of God. And like his royal cousin, Henry Hastings became committed to gospel truth at an early age, and he remained faithful to it for the rest of his life. But after Edward's death in 1553, aged 15, things got difficult for Henry Hastings because of his father's association with the regime run by the Lord Protector, the Duke of Northumberland, and his support of Lady Jane Grey's claim to the throne. And although Henry had no choice in the matter, his father had married him off, aged 17, to Northumberland's daughter, Catherine Dudley. And both Francis and Henry Hastings came under suspicion. They spent several months in the Tower of London before Queen Mary pardoned them, perhaps because of the Catholic sympathies of Henry's mother, Catherine Pole. So in Mary's reign, a minor, still under his father's authority, Henry Hastings wasn't free to act according to his own convictions. He tried to keep a low profile, but he was taken into the household of his great-uncle, Cardinal Reginald Pole, Mary's Catholic archbishop. Now, Henry Hastings' biographer, Clare Cross, puts it like this. To Henry Hastings, all of his promotions in Mary's reign must have had a bitter taste, and he can hardly have avoided reflecting whether he'd gained the world at the cost of his soul. Bishops Latimer, Ridley, and Archbishop Cranmer, whom he'd been taught to revere at the court of Edward VI, suffered death for their faith. Other godly ministers, including his former schoolmaster Richard Cox, went into exile on the continent. The Mass had taken the place of the sermons that Henry Hastings later delighted to hear. Rather than conform to Mary's Catholicism, some members of the nobility also fled to Switzerland or Germany. But Henry Hastings had no such alternative. His father, Francis, the second Earl, conformed to the Catholic regime, and he had to follow his father's lead. Nevertheless, Henry's interior resistance proved to be remarkable. The love lavished upon him by Cardinal Pole could not alter his private convictions in the slightest. His heart remained faithful to the gospel. And when Queen Mary died in 1558, there was great Protestant rejoicing as her half-sister Elizabeth succeeded her. Henry Hastings' father Francis died in June 1560, and thus Henry became the third Earl of Huntingdon at the age of 23, assuming all of his father's responsibilities. And the first of these duties was to give his father a fitting funeral. In July 1560, Francis, the second Earl, was buried in a splendid tomb in the chancel of St Helen's Church in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, the site of the family seat, and you can go and see that tomb today in the church. So what was he like then, this new young Earl? Well, he's been described as mild-mannered and serious-minded. He was fair and honest in his dealings with people, and even his enemies, who hated his forthright religious views, respected his character as an honourable and high-principled man, dedicated to serving his queen and country. And Henry's father's death had set him free for the first time in his life to act as he would. And without the least hesitation, he chose to advance the cause of true religion. And he knew there was much ignorance and superstition in the country, and he was determined to do all that he could to spread the light of the gospel in dark corners of the land. Clare Cross says, "Throughout Elizabeth's reign, Henry displayed an intense revulsion for Catholic false teaching and practices. And as soon as he had the means of patronage, his own personal income, at his own command, immediately he began to succour and support the ministers returning from exile after Mary's death. And these ministers were to play a part in Henry's vision to further God's kingdom in Leicestershire. And Henry Hastings began with his own household and family. And when he became Earl, he inherited a large household in Ashby Castle. And of course, many of you will have seen that castle, which is still there today, although it was ruined in the Civil War. Henry had a widowed mother and 10 brothers and sisters, for whom he was responsible, practically and spiritually. 2 of his brothers, George and Walter, remained Catholic sympathisers, but his other 2 brothers, Francis, who settled at Market Bosworth, and Edward, were enthusiastic supporters of the Puritan cause, like their eldest brother. And by his enemies, Francis Hastings was derisively called Henry's barking beagle because of his more combative personality. And in the castle at Ashby, there were over 75 household servants, ranging from ladies of the bedchamber to kitchen maids and grooms. When Henry's father had been alive, in Mary's reign, this household had observed Catholic practices. Daily prayers were said in Latin by a priest, and Mass would have been celebrated in the castle chapel. When the country became officially Protestant again in 1558, with the accession of Elizabeth, his father's household nominally became Protestant too. But Henry wasn't primarily concerned with just an outward show of conformity to the national church. He wanted people's hearts and minds to be changed, and he knew that it would take time to break down prejudices. So systematically, he and his wife Catherine set about the task of creating a godly household together by employing Puritan ministers as private tutors and chaplains. These men were there to expound the scriptures, catechize, and lead family devotions each day, which was attended by everyone, including the servants. The first and most famous of these household chaplains was Anthony Gilby, who was followed by another renowned Puritan minister, Arthur Hildersham. And through their preaching and teaching, these 2 men, under God, transformed not only the Earl's household, but also the town of Ashby and the county as a whole. And for a period of over 70 years, Ashby became renowned throughout the country as a beacon of gospel light, a city set upon a hill. And most of the town's 1,400 or so inhabitants were Hastings tenants. Many were employed directly at the castle, or they owed their livelihood to the extra business that was brought to the town by the presence of the Earl at the castle. So the Earl had great influence over their lives, which he used for good. He was very generous to the poor in Ashby. And the 3rd Earl set about bringing biblical truth to the town of Ashby by ensuring a plentiful supply of faithful gospel preaching. He had the right to present a man to the post of vicar in Ashby, and he made sure that he chose godly preachers for that office. He supplemented that ministry by financing extra preachers who were employed as lecturers, with more freedom from church regulations. And both Anthony Gilby and Arthur Hildersham gave weekday lectures in St Helen's Church, where the gospel was boldly proclaimed. The godly vicar, Thomas Widdows, worked in tandem with both men. Godly curates like John Brinsley, who also served as schoolmaster, were appointed. And it meant that men like these, who were ceremonial nonconformists, which meant they didn't agree with all the rituals of the Church of England, could worship according to their consciences. Assured of the Earl's support and protection, Ashby was a place of refuge for them. As well as this, the 3rd Earl set up Ashby Grammar School in 1567, endowing it with his own property. And his aim was not only to give local boys a good education, but also to educate them in spiritual truth. And in addition to studying the usual curriculum, they learnt Calvin's catechism, and they heard many sermons. Quite a few boys went on to become gospel preachers after leaving school, notably Nathaniel Gilby, son of Anthony, Samuel Hildesham, son of Arthur, Joseph Hall and William Bradshaw. But the Earl's influence went much wider than just Ashby. He was the leading nobleman in the whole of Leicestershire. As Lord Lieutenant of the county, he was the Queen's official representative, which involved a tremendous responsibility for the running of affairs on her behalf. Now it's just a ceremonial sort of role. Then it involved actual hard work. He had the duty of raising money for the crown, ensuring law and order was maintained in a time when there was no police force as we know it today. He had to ensure that the local militia was trained to defend the county or the Queen if attack was threatened. He had to promote Leicester's trade and economy. And he was responsible for the welfare of the poor. And all of these duties he carried out diligently, often using his own money to supplement the royal revenues. But not only this, Clare Cross says, from the first he saw that his rank in society brought him power to do not only good, to bring not only good, but godly government to the county. He cared intensely for the state of people's souls. Already in 1560, he conceived of his work in Leicestershire in specifically religious terms, as the punishment of superstition and error and the encouragement of true religion wherever it had begun to show its face. And you can still see evidence of the Earl's influence in Leicester today, especially if you go into the Guildhall next to the cathedral. Have any of you been into the Guildhall? You can go in, I think it's free. And in the Guildhall, you will see the Earl's coat of arms and the Bible verses, Ecclesiastes 12, 13 to 14. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In the Mayor's Parlour, there's a portrait of Henry Hastings, but it was commissioned 28 years after his death, so you can't trust it to give a true likeness. But it does show that even after all this time had elapsed, the corporation remembered with gratitude all that the Earl had done for Leicester, considering his time in office as a sort of golden age. The inscription with the portrait gives details of some of the things that he did for the good of the town, including giving generously out of his own purse to various worthy causes. And the Earl had the right to appoint vicars of 8 of the parish churches in the town of Leicester. He again made sure that faithful, zealous preachers were chosen. But he wasn't satisfied with that. In addition, he financed a public preacher, Geoffrey Johnson, for the whole town, based at St Martin's Church, now the cathedral. And the Earl had his own pew installed there in 1563 so that he could go and hear the preacher himself. And what an example he was setting to the townsfolk when the Earl was sitting there with them, hearing the gospel preached. And the town council, you can't imagine this today, but the town council ruled that one member of every household should attend the lectures given every Wednesday and Friday, and if people didn't comply, they could be fined 4p. Now, of course, the pews have been taken out and the cathedral's sole focus seems to be on Richard III. However, the figure of Henry Hastings does feature in the 19th century Vaughan porch. Don't know if it's one of your relatives, Aubrey, the Vaughan porch, above the main door. If you go into the cathedral, when you can go into the cathedral, you have to go in through the Vaughan porch. And you can tell which is Henry Hastings. If you look at all those figures, one of them is a bit different. Can you tell why one's different from the others? Question for the children. Can you spot any differences? He's the one with legs. No, the other ones the other ones have got legs, but they're all hidden by their clerical robes because he wasn't a minister, so he didn't wear long gowns like that. Well, many of the men that the Earl recruited to spearhead the evangelisation of Leicester were, like Gilby, nonconformist exiles recently returned from the continent. One was William Whittingham, who seemed to have acted as a sort of roving evangelist in the county in the early 1560s. Another was Thomas Sampson, who was thrown out of his church position at Oxford in 1565 for his refusal to wear the surplice. And the Earl appointed Sampson as master of Wigston Hospital in Leicester, which he had set about reforming. And Sampson rooted out remaining Catholic practices there. He preached regularly to the elderly residents and in the town of Leicester more generally. And in the same way as the Earl had set up a school in Ashby, he also set up the Free School in Leicester. Education was vital, he felt, for impressing biblical truths on young minds. And generously he gave of his own money to enable this scheme to happen. His brother Francis oversaw the project, aided by Thomas Sampson. And to improve the literacy and theological knowledge of all the clergy in Leicester, the Earl established a library of books. And originally this was housed in the Tower of St Martin's, but then was transferred in the 17th century to the Guildhall, where you can still see it's worth a visit, the Guildhall, 803 volumes on display. These books include the 15th century New Testament in Greek, known as the Codex Leicestrensis, and an English manuscript of John Wycliffe's sermons. There are also works by Erasmus and continental reformers such as Calvin, Peter Martyr, Oikolampardius, Zwingli and Bullinger. What a reminder of the truth that our city was once founded upon, and a stimulus to those who stand and proclaim those same truths in the open air in the city centre today. And our spiritual heritage in Leicestershire is a long one, and I reckon that we owe the greatest debt of gratitude under God to Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, for what he did to establish the gospel in our county. At a time when England was only just coming out of Catholicism, his determination to set about systematic reform and the use of his own position and money to plant gospel truth was remarkable. In 1589, Bishop Thomas Cooper of Lincoln expressed the view that by God's blessing, Leicestershire had been converted and brought to a state in which, in true religion, is above any other place, due to the efforts of two men, John Aylmer, former tutor of Lady Jane Grey, and the noble Earl of Huntingdon. Well, Henry Hastings wasn't a minister of the gospel himself, as we've said, but he recognised that faithful preachers were needed to carry out his spiritual mission in Leicestershire. And his first main recruit was Anthony Gilby. So let's now look at his crucial role in a bit more detail. Well, Anthony Gilby was an older man than the Earl. He was nearly 50 years old when he accepted the Earl's invitation to come to Ashby. He'd been born in Lincolnshire around 1510, and he was brought up strictly as a Roman Catholic. However, Gilby was converted in his youth. He was a student in Cambridge at the time of the great spread of Reformation truths in the late 1520s and early 1530s. And at Cambridge, Gilby was noted for his proficiency in mastering Hebrew, Greek and Latin. And Tyndale's New Testament in English was available at this time, but it was still illegal in the 1530s to read or own a Bible in English. So much of the official study would have been of the Latin Bible. Gilby was a passionate, committed man. He nailed his colours clearly to the Reformation mast in 1548, when he used his skills in the biblical languages to refute the defence of the Mass, written by Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, who was a champion of Roman Catholicism. After Edward VI came to the throne in 1547, Gilby began his career as an itinerant preacher in Leicestershire, but frustratingly we don't have any details of this. He also published 2 Old Testament commentaries on the prophets Micah and Malachi, so further evidence of his gifts as a biblical scholar. When Mary became queen in 1553, Gilby was a marked man because of its attack on Bishop Gardiner, who was now returned to favour. With other gospellers, Gilby fled to the continent rather than perish in the flames. Gilby first sought refuge in the reformed German city of Frankfurt, along with John Knox, the Scottish reformer, and John Fox, the martyrologist. However, a bitter dispute with later settlers caused Gilby, Knox and others to move to Geneva, arriving in October 1555. And it was the city, of course, where the famous John Calvin ministered. And it was described by an exiled English lady as, quote, the most perfect school of Christ that ever was in the earth since the days of the apostles. Gilby, like many others, was profoundly influenced by Calvin's teaching. Writing of Calvin, I do profess myself to be one of his scholars, and do praise God for the same more than for any other earthly matter. Refugees from persecution and biblical scholars from all over Europe flocked to the city and sat under Calvin's ministry, experiencing firsthand a model of the Reformation being implemented in practice. And Gilby lived in Geneva for 5 years and served as an elder and sometime pastor to the English congregation there. And incidentally, I chose that psalm because it was written by a friend and colleague of his at Geneva, William Keith. So I'm sure that they sang it in that version. Well, in Geneva, Gilby published further books, and he played a prominent part in the great work of the English exiles, the English Geneva Bible. And I've got a facsimile copy of it here, which you can look at later. It's very big and heavy. And I'll tell you why in a minute. The Geneva Bible translation set out to be as accurate as possible, sticking closely to the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. It was made by godly men like Gilby, one of the 7 main translators. These men who desired above all else the glory of God's holy name. And it was famous for its lengthy marginal explanatory notes, which run to over 300,000 words, which is a third of the length of the whole Bible text. So this is why it's so big. But very, very helpful. You're getting little commentaries and little explanations, even little sermons as part of the Bible. And the Geneva Bible became the favoured translation of the Puritans from its first publication in 1560 and even after the issue of the King James or Authorised Version in 1611. So when Gilby arrived back in England in 1560 with his wife and family, after seeing the Geneva Bible through the press, he was ably equipped for teaching the Earl's household the great biblical truths of the Reformation. And it was like setting up a Protestant seminary in miniature. And you've got 75 servants as well as all the other people in the household. From the Earl, Gilby received protection, financial support, and the opportunity to speak out boldly, both in the household and in the town of Ashby. And it meant that he didn't have to compromise his conscience by accepting a position in what he considered to be the insufficiently reformed Church of England. And Anthony Gilby spent the last 25 years of his life as Henry Hastings' preacher at Ashby. In 1570, Gilby published a translation of John Calvin's commentary upon the book of Daniel, and he dedicated it to his patron, specifying that it was, quotes, for the use of the family of the Right Honourable Earl of Huntingdon, to set forth as in a glass how one may profitably read the Scriptures, by considering the text, meditating on the sense thereof, and by prayer. In 1580, Gilby translated Theodore Beza's Psalms of David. And so Gilby would take the household through the Bible passages, a few verses at a time, then read the relevant part of the commentary, finishing with a prayer of Calvin's. And although sadly the Earl and Countess had no children of their own, they had many young nephews and nieces, and children from other noble families living with them, and several of these children were converted. The Earl also supported Gilby's son Nathaniel during his education in Cambridge, and Nathaniel too was to serve for a short time as household chaplain to the Earl, and he was with him when he died in York in 1595, where he held office as the Lord President of the Queen's Council in the North. And now we come to the evangelisation of Ashby. And Gilby never held the post of vicar of Ashby. In Ashby they think that he did, and they put his name on the list of vicars, but he never did. This allowed him liberty to follow his conscience, but he did work closely with Thomas Widdows, the godly vicar appointed by the Earl in 1569, and subsequently Widdows married Gilby's daughter Esther. Gilby and Widdows began weekday meetings called prophesyings, or exercises in Ashby, based on the Genevan pattern, and these were being set up across England. And the aim was to train the local clergy in preaching and improve their biblical education. Many of them were very ignorant. And this was vital if the truth was to be spread widely and superstition countered. And on a national scale, the historian Patrick Collinson reckons that, quotes, "The prophesyings did more than any other agency to propagate and establish the new religion in England." And the prophesyings also provided fellowship and mutual encouragement. A group of Leicestershire ministers wrote, "All men do know that sticks of fire scattered can give no such piercing heat as when they are laid together." At the meetings, the prophesyings, the ministers would work their way systematically through a book of the Bible. One of the senior men, like Gilby, would be appointed as moderator to oversee the proceedings, and a panel of 3 or 4 others would take it in turn to preach on the text for the day, and the last speaker concluding with a practical application of the doctrine that had been expounded. Then the moderator would invite any learned man present to confirm or to confute the doctrine delivered. And a large public audience was present, sitting with their Geneva Bibles open on their laps, must have had strong laps, searching for the texts referred to by the preachers. And as soon as the formal part of proceedings was over, all of the people, and I like this bit, men and women, boys and girls, labourers, workmen and simpletons, would hotly discuss what they had heard among themselves. And people who would only reluctantly walk a few yards to hear their own minister preach on a Sunday wouldn't think anything of travelling 6 or 7 miles to the prophesying. And during the 1560s and 1570s, the prophesyings were tolerated by the church authorities. And at their height, there were similar exercises attracting great crowds across the Midlands, in places such as Leicester itself, Nottingham, Mansfield, Retford, Grantham, Stamford, Oundle, Uppingham, Huntingdon, Coventry, Southam and Northampton, and other places. Finally, the authorities got nervous about the popularity of the prophesyings, over which they had no control. In 1576, the Queen ordered their suppression. Gilby protested to the local bishop that everything was done lawfully and above board at the Ashby exercise, saying, "We the ministers do nothing nor say anything in secret corners, lest we might have been misjudged. But leaving open the church doors, as was convenient, the people of themselves, knowing that it is always lawful to hear God's word, holy day and working day, by many or by few, did of themselves quietly come to pray with us and to learn some good lessons in God's schoolhouse." But when the prophesyings were shut down, evangelical desire found an outlet in the solemn fasts held before communion services. In 1579, Gilby was invited to assist in preaching at such a fast when large crowds gathered to hear 3 or 4 sermons interspersed with devotions leading up to the Lord's Supper, which was received not kneeling, as the prayer book stipulated, but standing, as Puritans advocated. When the Earl set up Ashby Grammar School in 1567, Gilby was a founding trustee. And Gilby had a profound influence on the curriculum, and the boys would often hear him preach. And Joseph Hall, later godly Bishop of Exeter and Norwich, was a pupil at the school after Gilby's time, but he remembered his mother being so devoted to Gilby's ministry that it was her practice to repeat choice extracts from his sermons to her son. And Joseph Hall declared, "How often have I blessed the memory of those divine passages which I've heard from her mouth." And although Ashby was the main focus for Gilby's work, his spiritual authority was widely recognised. Many of his friends, exiled with him on the continent in Mary's reign, came to Leicestershire on his recommendation, and together they had an enormous impact on the spiritual life of the county. In 1571, Gilby had been in trouble with the church authorities when he refused to swear that everything in the prayer book was biblical. In 1584, the year of Gilby's death, over 300 Leicestershire ministers refused to subscribe to similar articles presented to them. As one historian says, between them, the Earl and Gilby had produced a Puritan county. In other words, by God's power, they'd helped to transform Leicestershire into a place where the Bible was known and loved, and obedience to it was of first importance. Well, here we're concentrating on Gilby's work in Leicestershire, but mention should be made of his influence throughout England. Gilby kept up a regular correspondence with many who'd been in exile with him. And such was his zeal for the truth that when necessary, he didn't hesitate to reprove those he saw beginning to compromise or fall short of the ideals that they once espoused. And even when his correspondents were now bishops, Gilby did not falter in issuing a reprimand or a reminder, which was usually accepted. And really, he was acting as a true bishop or superintendent, even though he held no official post in the church. A critic said derisively that Gilby ruled as a bishop from Ashby. Gilby also wrote books attacking any remnants of Roman Catholicism that he saw remaining in the Church of England, and he warned of the dangers that these, quotes, toys of popery posed to simple ignorant folk who could so easily be led into idolatry by such things, and what they needed was simple, straightforward biblical truth. Gilby's enemies accused him of being a dangerous radical, out to destroy the stability of the national church. However, this was far from the case. He continued to regard the Church of England as an evangelical church, despite the many corruptions that remained within it, and he desired its peace and unity. Well, Gilby died in 1584 in his mid-70s, just weeks after his wife Elizabeth, and he was buried in Ashby Church, in his will made only 3 days before his death. He describes himself as one of the ministers of God's holy work in Ashby de la Zouch. And he goes on to give testimony to the work of God in his life. And this is a pretty good testimony. I do give the Lord my God most humble thanks for his great mercy toward me many ways, being his poor creature. Chiefly that he did draw me out of that horrible darkness of Romish superstition and anti-Christian idolatry, wherein in my childhood I was drowned by the general corruption of the time. But in my very youth, speedily, he called me forth and mercifully delivered and preserved me. From that day to this day, in all alterations and persecutions, God has given me grace to profess Jesus Christ, our only sufficient Saviour, and both publicly and privately to detest all the inventions and traditions of that Romish Antichrist. Yet herein, as in all the course of my life, I must cry for mercy and pardon of my manifold offences, and seek mercy of my God in his well-beloved Son, in whom only I trust to be saved, and constantly believe that after this miserable life shall be ended, my soul shall be with our head, Christ, his dearly beloved Son, in the everlasting paradise, and shall receive the appointed joy of the everlasting kingdom prepared for us from the beginning of the world, and that my body, being laid in the earth, shall be raised up a glorious body at that great and notable day of his glorious appearance, when both body and soul shall be joined together and enjoy the crown of glory in the heavenly mansions for evermore. And so died Anthony Gilby, Leicestershire's Mr. Valiant for the truth. He desired to live for God's glory alone. He'd helped to translate the scriptures, preach the gospel widely, refused to compromise on biblical standards, and worked tirelessly for reformation in the English church. Though disappointed that more had not been achieved in this regard, Gilby regarded it as God's sovereign judgment on the nation for despising God's word. And if the Church of England had heeded his call to root out all vestiges of Roman Catholic practices, many later divisions might have been avoided. But in Leicestershire itself, Gilby had helped to establish a godly commonwealth. The work was not finished, of course, and we now come to our third and final Puritan, Arthur Hildisham, of whom you can read a lot more in my book. So in 1587, 3 years after Gilby's death, The third Earl invited his young cousin, Arthur Hildesham, their mothers actually were cousins, a similarly committed and gifted preacher, to fill Gilby's place. In the providence of God, the Earl had already supported Hildesham financially in his studies at Cambridge University, when Hildesham's own parents, zealous Roman Catholics, had disinherited him for refusing to enter the Catholic priesthood. Hildesham went on to have a tremendous influence for the gospel in Ashby for over 40 years, but he couldn't have done what he did without the patronage of the third Earl of Huntingdon and his successors. And in a book published in 1628, dedicated to the fifth Earl, Hildesham acknowledged his great debt to the Hastings family, writing that he wished to give public testimony unto the world of my duty and thankfulness unto your honour and unto your noble house, unto whom, next under God, I owe whatsoever poor abilities he's been pleased to give unto me for the service of his church. For as that noble uncle of yours, the third Earl, did first maintain me in the university, and after brought me to the exercise of my ministry in this place, so I have been, by the favour of your noble grandfather, the fourth Earl, and of your honour, continued here now more than 40 years. And when Hildesham settled in Ashby in 1587, he was 24 years old. For 6 years he served as lecturer or preacher, delivering midweek sermons in the church and in the surrounding areas, complementing the regular Lord's Day ministry of the vicar, Thomas Widdows. After Widdows' death in 1593, the Earl invited Hildesham to become Vicar of Ashby in his place, in addition to continuing as lecturer, so a busy man. Hildesham served as Vicar of Ashby for 12 years, until 1605. He was a faithful minister of the gospel, a diligent Bible expositor, who loved his congregation. Large numbers from the districts around flocked to hear him preach, and there were many conversions. But although the prophesyings had been shut down by this stage, a group of local Puritan ministers still met regularly for fellowship at Ashby under Hildesham's leadership. But although Ashby Church was full, Hildesham was never complacent. He knew that there were many who gave mere outward lip service to the gospel, but didn't have a living faith in Christ. Besides, Hildesham was aware that lots of people spent their Sabbaths drinking in Ashby's alehouses rather than attending worship services in God's house. And in 1605, Hildesham was ejected from his vicarage for nonconformity, and he was never reinstated. And to understand why that happened, we need to look at what was happening nationally at this time. James I had come to the English throne in 1603 on the death of Queen Elizabeth I. And early Puritan hopes that James would be sympathetic to their desires for further reformation in the Church of England were soon quashed at the Hampton Court Conference of 1604, when measures were passed requiring ministers to assent to everything in the prayer book and to conform to all the ceremonial requirements of the church. And subscription to these articles was subsequently vigorously enforced because King James hated Puritans. And Hildesham himself was a ceremonial nonconformist, as Anthony Gilby had been before him, and he couldn't, in conscience, subscribe to such a declaration. And we haven't got time to go into great detail on this issue now, but the unbiblical and superstitious ceremonies to which he and others like him objected included making the sign of the cross when a child was baptised, wearing the surplice, a long white gown worn by ministers to administer communion. Puritans called it a popish rag. And most of all, kneeling to receive the Lord's Supper. And they regarded this as the greatest idolatry, a sign of worshipping the elements of bread and wine, which the Catholics believed had become the literal body and blood of Christ, who was thus sacrificed anew every time the Mass was celebrated, when the scriptures tell us that he died once for all. And because Hildesham was regarded as a leader of the Puritans, King James seems to have conceived a particular dislike for him, and he was severely targeted for his nonconformity, especially when he no longer had the third Earl to protect him. Well, after his ejection in 1605, Hildesham continued to live in Ashby, and he had periods when he was permitted to preach in his capacity as lecturer, though not as vicar. A series of other vicars filled that position, but the people still regarded Hildesham as their true pastor and awaited his reinstatement, which, as I said, never actually happened. Between 1609 and 1611, Hildesham delivered his great series of 108 midweek lectures on the 4th chapter of John's Gospel in St Helen's Church. He also preached regularly in nearby places such as Burton-on-Trent and Repton. However, enemies of the Puritans, like Richard Neile, Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, and William Laud, later Archbishop of Canterbury, were looking for any opportunity to discredit them. And when it was rumoured, quite falsely, that Edward Whiteman, the last person to be burned for heresy in England in 1612, it was rumoured that he'd learnt some of his heretical ideas by listening to Hildesham's preaching in Burton. Hildesham was called to give account at Whiteman's trial in Lichfield Cathedral. And despite the fact that Hildesham was completely exonerated, he continued to be regarded with great suspicion by the church authorities, and you can read the full story of this episode in my book. Well, this suspicion culminated in a complete suspension for preaching for Hildesham in the following year, 1613. He was silenced for 12 years. Here he was 49 years old, with a wife and 5 surviving children. The youngest was only 8. So what was he to do when he was banned from preaching, which he believed God had called him to? Well, despite being rejected by the Church of England, Hildesham did not choose to separate from it. He looked back to the foundation of the church in the early days of the Reformation, its Calvinist doctrinal basis, and the martyrs who died for those truths. And he declared that as long as the Church of England had true gospel preaching and had a right administration of the sacraments, then it would be wrong to separate from it. He recognised there were many things that were unbiblical in the church, and he clearly took a stand against them. And he stated his position in this way: those assemblies that enjoy the word and doctrine of salvation, though they have many corruptions remaining in them, are to be acknowledged the true churches of God, and are such as none of the faithful may make separation from. He warned that till God has forsaken a church, no man may forsake it. Well, Hildesham suffered misunderstanding and criticism for the position he took, both from separatists on the one hand, who urged him to join them, and from conformists in the church on the other hand, who saw him as a nit-picking troublemaker. And by following his conscience, Hildesham was subjected to further persecution at the hands of the church authorities. In 1615, after another campaign of lies and false charges against him, he was imprisoned in London, heavily fined, branded as the chief ringleader of the schismatics, and degraded from the ministry completely. He spent 2 years on the run, taking refuge in the homes of supporters in London and in the country. And at his lowest ebb, in 1616, he received overtures from the English congregation in Leiden, in Holland, begging him to become their pastor. Hildesham was greatly esteemed in the Netherlands, where his sermons were widely read. And this invitation must have been very appealing to Hildesham. He'd not been able to preach for 3 years, and he resolved to accept it. But he didn't go. Not for any theological reasons or because he felt it was his duty to stay in England. He would have gone, quotes, had not his wife's unwillingness to go over the seas detained him here. So Hildesham was obviously sensitive to his wife's qualms and took this into account when the decision was made. In the late 1620s, when the screw was tightened further on nonconformists, about 30,000 chose to emigrate to New England in order to be able to worship according to their consciences. And although Hildesham felt that by this stage he was too old to go, he encouraged younger ministers like Francis Higginson from Claybrook and John Cotton from Boston in Lincolnshire to take this option. Hildesham advised, "Were I a younger man and under your case and call, I would think I had a plain invitation of heaven unto the voyage." But instead, Hildesheim remained in Ashby, and he sought to commend the gospel of Christ in whatever ways were still open to him. And he did this primarily through his personal example and witness. Now, everyone in Ashby knew where Hildesheim lived, in his prominent house on Wood Street. Now, that isn't actually Hildesheim's house. It's an 18th century house built on the site of Hildesheim's earlier house, which was a Tudor building. But you can still see on the wall at the side some stones from the original building, which was pulled down during the Civil War. And just for Hildesheim, continuing to live a consistent life amongst the people that he'd served for so many years was in itself a testimony to God's grace in time of trial and a demonstration of Hildesheim's commitment to his flock. And as the public functions of preaching and other clerical duties were closed to him, his home became increasingly important as the place where he could exercise a different kind of ministry. Here, he continued his habitual practice of hospitality and household religion. We're told that in all places where he did reside, he was always helpful in family prayers, in expounding the scriptures read, and in the repetition of the sermons preached in the public congregation. And strictly speaking, these devotions were for the benefit of the family and servants, but the many visitors to his home were often included. And even Hildesheim's secret prayer wasn't always private. He was regularly overheard by visitors who heard him audibly pouring his heart out to God. And Hildesheim continued with his normal routine of reading a chapter of the Bible every morning and then walking alone for about an hour to meditate on what he had read. And it's likely that many would have witnessed him in the fields around Ashby, deep in prayer and thought. And it was also reported that Mr. Hildesheim used to preach in his own house when silenced, and 2 or 3 families came to hear him. But it's important to remember that Hildesheim continued to attend the public services in the parish church, and he encouraged others to do the same, even when the minister used the ceremonies to which he objected, saying, "If the worship I go unto is, for the substance of it, pure and according to God's ordinance, the corruptions and sins which another brings into it cannot defile it unto me." Hildesheim was described as being exemplary life and pleasant in discourse, so people knew that they could go to him for spiritual counsel. We're told that he was, quote, willing by private conference to instruct the ignorant, to satisfy the doubtful, to settle the wavering, to comfort the dejected, and to encourage all sorts in the exercises of religion. And thus, by informal and unofficial means, Hildesheim was able to sustain a powerful spiritual ministry amongst his neighbours. He also wrote letters to those seeking advice. He was involved in town business, day-to-day charitable work amongst the poor, and school affairs. And at Hildesheim's death, it was remarked upon that the poor folk of Ashby mourned him especially because of his great kindness to them. But God in his providence was very gracious to Hildesheim at the end of his life. After the accession of King Charles I in 1625, Hildesheim was relicensed as a minister of the gospel. That plague summer of 1625 saw Hildesheim restored to his position of lecturer, not vicar, of Ashby, and he was allowed to resume preaching again, aged nearly 62. And that's the context of this book of sermons, Fasting, Prayer and Humiliation for Sin. They were preached during that plague summer of 1625 in Ashby when Hildesheim was restored. And he was able to preach for another 6 years. And in this period, he delivered a massive series, listen to this, preachers, 152 sermons on Psalm 51. Well, the first 7 verses of Psalm 51, he didn't finish it. And it was recorded that though weakened, this happiness God vouchsafed to him, which was more than ordinary, that he outlived not his parts. That is, he retained all his faculties. But as his graces increased towards the end, so his abilities in preaching of invention, judgment, memory, and elocution decayed not in his age. He left a precious memory behind him and had, in the apostles' words, letters of commendation written in the hearts of many. Hildesham died in 1632 and he's buried in Ashby Church, where his son Samuel erected a monument in his memory, which you can still see, though it's quite hard to read. It's still there in Ashby Church. Hildesham's life and witness had a profound impact on several generations of Ashby's residents. And even during the Civil War period, more than a decade after his death, it was said that many people in the town remained affected by his teaching and example. So a very brief conclusion. Are the Puritans relevant to us today? I could just answer that question in a word. Yes. I believe that the spiritual wisdom of the Puritans has never been more relevant than it is today. An antidote to our too often superficial and quick-fix Christianity. And reading the Puritans opens the door to a rich treasury of serious biblical teaching, both doctrinal and practical, that will challenge your mind and engage your heart. If you're like me, you'll soon realise that you are a pygmy entering a world of spiritual giants. If you don't know where to begin and you're put off by the old language, there are many abridged and modernised versions of Puritan classics now available, such as the Banner of Truth Puritan paperback series. And a lady in Leicester once told me that she read through this book, Jeremiah Burroughs' The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, every year. And it's a jewel. It's worth doing. And the Puritans knew from their Bibles and from experience that life is tough. Between the 20th of March and the 17th of April 1627, Hildesham gave his congregation in Ashby 8 practical means for obtaining grace to bear the cross patiently, to bear all kinds of affliction patiently and comfortably, whensoever God shall be pleased to exercise us by it. I'm not going to give you all 8 points. I'll just close with this final point, which still seems a very relevant one. Instant and earnest prayer and continuing in it is the means to make us patient in tribulation. Would you know the true cause you have so little patience? Surely it is because you pray so little. Let the signs God gives us every day of marvellous troublesome times that are at hand make us all the more frequent and fervent in prayer. Is there any such means either to stand in the gap and keep out God's judgments, or to prepare us with patience and strength to bear them, as fasting and prayer is? Well, take this for a conclusion to your comfort, which you shall read, Acts 2:20-21. When the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood, when the darkest and saddest time shall come, yet it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And he that can pray shall do well enough. Thank you.